welcome everybody, and thank you for your patience. So this is our first seminar of the year, and we have the pleasure to have today a very interesting paper on EU issue voting in the European elections by Luca Carrieri and Nicolò Conti. Luca Carrieri is assistant professor at the University of Rome, where he focuses on electoral behavior. And Nicolò Conti is professor at the University of Rome as well, where he studies the EU's impact on party systems and the attitudes of elites and citizens towards the EU. And their presentation today will be discussed by Giuseppe Carteny, who is postdoctoral researcher at the Center for European Social Research at the University of Mannheim, where his work concentrates on political attitudes and behavior. So Nicolò and Luca, you have the floor for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion first with Giuseppe for 5 to 10 minutes, and then with the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I hope you can hear me well and you can see me well. I'm going to present today, and I'm going to present this piece of research that I'm conducting together with Luca Carrieri, my colleague in Rome, who is also here today. And basically, we're working on EU mobilization and party support, and so we're trying to investigate the impact of EU issue voting. So first of all, why are we interested in EU issue voting? Well, of course, we know that the literature has invested quite a lot in demonstrating that politicization of the EU has increased over the past decades. We also have a ever-growing literature on anti-EU mobilization. And we also have a more recent literature which shows that there is quite a lot of EU politicization also managed by the mainstream parties. In particular, we have seen that there is often a challenge by the opposition parties to shift blame to, let's say, also also create a challenge to the on the government parties, and in particular on the government parties and EU couple for policy failure. So often the opposition attacks the government parties for policy failures, and in this also the EU is often involved. We have seen that there are processes which have been documented in the literature about EU attitudes becoming more relevant, becoming more relevant both in the citizens' demands, but also in the party supply. And so what remains to be understood is whether a nexus exists between party supply and voters' demands, because there are contending views basically about the impact of EU issue voting. EU issue voting that has been defined in particular by De Vries in 2010 as the process whereby individual preferences on European integration influence directly the voting choices in the national elections. So there are contending views whether this really has materialized, whether this really is relevant in patterns of voting behavior. There are those who maintain that EU attitudes have limited effects, only limited effects on voting choices. But on the opposite side, there are those instead who claim that EU attitudes have become more and more relevant for voting choices. So this is our starting point. And from here, we have defined our research goal, which is to study the degree to which party attitudes towards the EU and the voting preferences of citizens are connected. So we're interested in understanding whether there is a good match, there is a relationship between EU attitudes and votes for parties. And for this reason, we focus on the party-voter couple, the party-voter dyad. We are interested to understand whether there is a good match between demand and supply. And so the research questions that we have formulated are as follows. Does a link exist between parties and the voters regarding European integration? do EU issues play a significant role in the voting preferences of citizens? So these are the research questions that we put forward. And according to the literature, we have formulated some hypotheses. In particular, there are contributions which testify to the greater importance of EU integration for mobilization, where the EU conflict is stronger in society, where there are parties that exert issue ownership over the EU and maybe take more extreme positions on the EU. And so following this literature, we are formulating 3 hypotheses. The first one is a EU positional distance hypothesis. So basically, we hypothesize that the smaller the distance between the party and the voter on the EU, the higher the voter's likelihood to vote for that party. So this is something that normally has been applied to left-right, to other important dimensions of conflict, which characterize the cleavage structure of a society. And so here we posit the same kind of hypothesis concerning EU positional distance. Then we have a second hypothesis, which is instead a EU party salience hypothesis. And here we hypothesize that the higher the salience assigned by a party to the EU, so the more a party emphasizes the EU in its discourse, in its supply, the stronger the mechanism that we have seen before. So the stronger this mechanism concerning EU positional distance, or let's say EU closeness between the party and the voter. So we imagine that those parties that emphasize the most the EU are also those parties which capitalize, benefit the most from closeness on the EU with voters. And then the third hypothesis is a party ideology, EU party ideology hypothesis, because basically here we hypothesize that there is a differential impact of this mechanism of EU positional distance, depending on the party stance on the EU. And here the general expectation is that the Eurosceptical parties, so opponents to the EU, are those which capitalize the most on the EU cleavage or EU dimension of conflict. So this is the let's say, general expectation. We know that there is quite a lot of literature about anti-EU mobilization. And so maybe we should expect that there is a, let's say, better capacity of the Eurosceptical parties to mobilize voters on the basis of attitudes towards the EU, the stance on the EU. So in terms of data and method, here we have basically 2 different goals. On the one hand, we are working on a small n research, a research which has focused on 5 countries. I will explain later why this has been the case, 5 Western European countries. And on the other hand, we have a larger N research project, which instead includes all EU member states. So for the large N, we use the data which are available. In particular, we use for individual level data, survey data, we use the European election studies, and then to trace the position of parties, we use Chapel Hill. But then we have another possibility, which is to use other data which have been collected on the occasion of national elections, first-order elections, because we know that the European election studies refers to European elections, so second-order elections. But we have the possibility to access data which instead of collected information concerning first order elections. So first order national elections in a number of countries. We have Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and the Netherlands. So this does not, of course, represent the whole of Western Europe, but still a sizable part with larger and medium-sized member states. We also have North and South. So it is quite diverse, and I think, well, this is quite representative of Western Europe. So in this case, we have richer information, because not only we have a survey which has been conducted by the Issue Competition Comparative Project, based on, it's a public opinion survey based on national elections, but also we have information gathered on the Twitter campaigns of parties and parties leaders on the occasion of those elections. And then we also have information from Chapel Hill on party positions. So working on these 5 countries allow us to have a more fine-grained data analysis, because not only we could refer to the public opinion data, but we can also refer to salience as it is measured by Chapel Hill. Well, we all know about Chapel Hill. I don't think I need to spend too many words on that data set, but we also have more specific information about how the EU has been emphasized in the electoral campaign on Twitter. Okay. So our dependent variable for both research undertakings, so both the small n and the large n analysis, the dependent variable is the propensity to vote for parties. So this is a dependent variable which is clearly gathered at the individual level. It comes from the public opinion survey. And we measure for each individual the propensity or the probability to vote for each given party in a party system. So there will be higher probability, lower probability, depending on the party. We have built a stacked by party data matrix where each individual, each respondent is multiplied by the number of parties available in the party system. But these are technicalities. Maybe we can be back to that during the discussion. Our independent variable, testing hypothesis 1, is the party voter EU distance. Remember that I said that we're going to focus on the party voter couple, the party voter dyad. And so we measure that through our independent variable as the EU distance, which is calculated as the absolute distance between the position of the voter and the position of the party on the EU. So for the position of the voter, we have the public opinion survey data at our disposal, whereas for the party position, we have the Chapel Hill measurements at our disposal. So this is to test hypothesis 1, party voter EU distance, and then we analyze how this impacts on the propensity to vote for the different parties. And then for the test of hypothesis 2, remember, hypothesis 2 deals with salience, with emphasis. We hypothesize that those parties which emphasize the EU the most are also those which capitalize the most on this EU mobilization. And so in this case, we have an interaction because we interact salience, party salience, with the EU distance variable to verify whether this is really the case, that those parties which emphasize the EU the most are also those which capitalize the most on EU mobilization, or let's say their closeness with voters in terms of EU positions. And then for the test of hypothesis 3, we have another interaction, because you remember here we said that we hypothesize a differentiated impact for Eurosceptical and pro-European parties. And so here we interacted the party stance on the EU or the party ideology on the EU, whether it is Eurosceptic or pro-European. This is interacted with our main independent variable, the EU distance variable. So results. We have mostly results for the 5 countries, for the small and in-depth analysis. And the first finding that we have is that the EU distance variable really is statistically significant as a factor swaying electoral support for parties. So in our model, in our regression model, yes, we find that the EU distance variable is related to propensity to vote for the different parties. And to be more precise, because we have a very long model that, of course, will not be easy to show here, I will just show some plots to make the reading easier, I hope. But I can tell you that in the model we have controls for several distance variables. So not only we consider the EU positional distance, but we also consider the left-right positional distance, the immigration positional distance, to understand what the impact is of EU attitudes when also these other distance variables are considered in the analysis. So this is done in order not to overestimate the impact of EU positional distance. And we find that the left-right distance is the most important voting determinant among all the positional predictors. Maybe this is not totally surprising, but what is probably most interesting is that the EU distance, when compared to other controls, to other positional distances, such as economic redistribution distance, immigration distance, well, EU positional distance stands in between. So in the end, this is quite impressive, because here we are considered those which are normally seen as the most influential distance variables, left, right, economic redistribution, immigration. And we find that although less impactful than left, right, EU positional distance stands in between economic redistribution and immigration. So no bad as a result. There are some differences among countries, with Austria and Germany showing a more marked pattern of EU issue voting with respect to the other countries, but we will see that the relationship is verified for all the countries considered. So in the end, our hypothesis 1 is confirmed, and citizens do tend to support those parties that are closest to their own position on the EU. And here I'm going to show you some data. Here we have some plots with the marginal effects of EU distance. And basically here, we should interpret this as the larger the distance, the smaller the likelihood to vote for a given party. So you see that here results are more impactful in the case of Germany and Austria, where the larger the voter distance from the party position, the smaller the likelihood to vote for a given party. But we see that, let's say, the relationship is verified also for the other countries, although a bit less impactful. Then, as to hypothesis 2, so you remember this deals with salience, with the emphasis that parties assign to the EU, how much they speak about the EU, let's say. Simply simply said. So we interacted the EU distance variable with the two measures of EU salience. We have one which is pretty much established, which is the measurement made by Chapel Hill. So we have a salience variable in Chapel Hill that we have imported here. But then we also have another salience variable, which is more specific and has to do with Twitter. So the emphasis parties and their leaders have assigned to the EU in their Twitter communication, in their Twitter campaigns on the occasion of first order elections. I forgot to say that the period we analyzed is 2017 and 2018, which is the period where first order elections were run in these 5 countries. So this allows us to basically assess the impact of salience in broad terms and in more specific Twitter terms, because we know that Chapel Hill measurement of salience is a broad and encompassing measurement of salience. When experts assign scores on salience for Chapel Hill, they consider everything. They consider the communication efforts of party leaders. They consider press releases, they consider social media, but they also consider parliamentary speeches and so on. So basically this is unlimited. Whereas instead, in the case of Twitter, we only analyze salience assigned by party leaders to the EU in their official Twitter communication. So this is more limited, and this allows to assess the impact of broad salience on the one hand and specific Twitter salience on the other hand. And our findings show mixed empirical backing. This is because the interacting power of the Chapel Hill salience is confirmed, whereas instead the interacting power of Twitter emphasis is not confirmed because it's not significant in our models. It's not statistically significant in our models. So this suggests that maybe because Twitter has a more restricted use, is not so impactful on the broad population. Basically, the data we're using are representative of the whole population of the different countries analyzed. So maybe because, again, Twitter is a more elitarian, maybe, medium that is not in the, let's say, media diets, media consumption of everyone, it has not reached that impact on voting decisions of the broad populations, as instead has the broader EU salience, which has been measured by Chapel Hill. So mixed findings in this case. And you see here, we show the plot of our interaction. So basically here we show how when salience grows, the impact of the distance variable also increases. So you see that at the highest levels of EU salience, so on the right side of the horizontal axis, you have higher salience. And when you have higher salience, you see that the impact of the EU distance variable changes, shifts. So it becomes more impactful. So yes, we have this interacting power of EU salience, because those parties that do assign emphasis, assign importance, prominence to the EU are also those parties which benefit, take advantage the most from the EU positional closeness to voters. And then hypothesis 3, this has to do with Eurosceptical versus pro-European parties. And here we found quite interesting and for us astonishing, maybe not fully surprising, but still quite unprecedented findings, because we found that the relationship has become, well, is, because we don't have a time series. We only consider one election by country, but we find that at this time point, this relationship is this, let's say, match between voters and parties is greater, is larger for the pro-European parties. So all our analysis proves to be more impactful on the side of the pro-European parties than the Eurosceptical parties. What does it mean? Does it mean we have a unprecedented pro-EU mobilization? Does it have to do with Brexit? Because the context, of course, in those years was pretty much influenced by Brexit. Certainly, this finding contradicts previous contribution, arguing that Eurosceptics hold more incentives to prime EU issues than Europhiles. And it shows that actually Europhiles maybe strike back. This is the title of the book by my colleague and co-author Luca Carrieri, Pro-Europeans Strike Back. It is exactly the idea that there has been in recent years a pro-EU mobilization, which was not there before, because we know that for many years EU mobilization was especially anti-EU mobilization. So we find out that the mechanism is impactful on both kinds of parties, but actually we also find that the EU distance matters more for the Europhile parties than for the Eurosceptic ones. And you see here the marginal effects, which are greater for the pro-EU parties. And this is when we separate pro-EU, anti-EU as a dummy variable, so into two categories. But also when we instead consider the whole continuum of stances, you see in the horizontal axis that when the EU position becomes more favorable, more supportive of the EU, more pro-European, to the right side of the horizontal axis, the marginal effects are greater. Okay. And then I would like to show you some results, some tentative results concerning the 27 EU member states. So the first part of the analysis, which I've shown so far, this will be much more rapid, I have to say. So I'll try to conclude in 5 minutes. Basically, the first part, which is also the more advanced part of our analysis, was based on 5 countries and also on data which were collected, if not on purpose for this research, but at least can provide to this research quite a lot of information. Now we're trying to replicate also for the 27 member states, and here we have some problems. First of all, because to use national election data is more complicated for the 27 member states. There are national election surveys, of course, but there are some troubles. So the way to consider the 27 countries altogether is to use the European Election Studies Survey, where data are instead very much standardized, but they refer to second-order elections. So we could observe a mechanism that is very much different, exactly because of the different paradigm of second-order elections. And also, we don't dispose here of the same information concerning Twitter salience. We only have information for the broad party salience on the EU as measured by Chapel Hill. Despite of this, we find out, given all these differences, when the 27 member states are considered, and we use the data on the European elections, we find that this, the impact of EU positional distance has increased over the years. Here, of course, we dispose of the whole time series. So when we go back in time, we see that in 2014, the effects of EU distance were smaller, and in 2009 were even smaller than in 2019. So this seems to testify that the EU positional distance effect has become greater over time. This is something we could not document with the 5-country analysis, because there we only dispose of one point in time. But here, although we have different data referring to the European election, the interest is to have a time series where our main hypotheses are verified and even strengthened by the results. And then I would like to show you the difference for the pro-European, the Eurosceptic parties, and you see that the effects are greater in 2019 for the Europhile parties. So again, this verifies, confirms our previous findings, this time extended to the 27 member states and to the European elections. But especially what is interesting is that things have changed after 2014. So basically this pro-EU mobilization and pro-Europeans striking back is something that is verified for the 2019 elections and before for the 2018 and 17, but not for 2014. So it seems that something has changed in between. And of course, we interpret this as the effect of Brexit, but also the fact that the crisis, the effects of the Great Recessions are over. I mean, there can be different interpretations or mixed interpretations for that, but what is interesting is that the pattern has changed since after Brexit. So our final remarks, our provisional findings show that the EU positional distance between voters and parties is a factor determining the electoral support, the electoral success of parties. So the smaller the EU distance between a voter and a party, the greater the propensity of the same voter to support the same party. We also found that higher level of EU salience, but broad salience as documented by CHES, not Twitter salience, increase the effects of EU positional distance. And also we find that there is a phenomenon of pro-EU mobilization that was not there in the past, and that has maybe replaced the anti-EU mobilization of past decades, or balanced at least the phenomenon of anti-EU mobilization of past decades. So now, future steps. We would like to compare first and second order elections, and try to use a research design which is fully compatible for the two levels. We would like to spend more attention to understand what goes on with those parties which exert an issue ownership on the EU, those which are more entrepreneurial on the EU. We are trying to apply a index of entrepreneurship to understand whether those parties which are more entrepreneurial on the EU also take more advantage on this mechanism. And then, this is more complicated, we would like to also isolate and understand both switches which are correlated with party EU positional shifts. We have an article which is forthcoming on the Italian Political Science Review, and it is the article on electoral mobilization and party support for the 5 countries that we considered into our more in-depth analysis. So this is coming out between end of January and beginning of February, and here you find, let's say, all the data that I've shown, plus, of course, more in-depth information. and then the large-scale analysis is still in progress. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolò. So now I give the floor to Giuseppe for 5 to 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here as a discussant of this super interesting paper by Luca and Nicolò. And in the following minutes, I will present some comments about this paper, a short summary first, and then some comments about different aspects of the paper that, in my opinion, are worth for further discussions, or perhaps even some additional attention. Now, as Luca and Nicolò presented in detail, the paper investigates whether and to what extent individual attitudes toward the EU, and in particular the distance between voters and parties on these dimensions, affect vote choice, and the extent to which this relationship is moderated by political parties' behavior. Now, in other words, as stated by the authors, the main goal is to establish whether there is a nexus, a link between parties and voters on this dimension, and how this link affects the voting behavior of individuals. And they do so because, well, as they brilliantly explained, in the background is pretty clear, the background about politicization of the EU, of the conflict. But at the same time, there are mixed findings that derives also by difference in research designs, by the cases considered, or the time period that has been considered. Now, I think that I do believe that the paper by Luca and Nicolò actually is able to fulfill its promises. And indeed, it shows pretty clear that there is a link between parties and voters on this issue, that the distance between voters and parties on this issue is pretty important, and they do so relying on a methodology, and more particularly on a research design that allows to test this link pretty well. That is the stake data matrix approach, in which the observations are not individuals, but actually the relationship between each individual and each relevant party inside a given political system. Now, I think that the paper actually offers intriguing results and findings, starting from the differences between Eurosceptic and Europhile parties, and how the voters of the different parties, actually, the importance of EU distance for these, for voting for different parties, for Europhile and Eurosceptic parties. And I'm also pretty intrigued by the results about the effect of different measures of salience. And I start really from here to present some comments about the what I think could be better elaborated, or perhaps something that could be even addressed in the analysis, especially when moving to the EES analysis that allows for a broader picture as compared to the ECCP-based analysis. Now, indeed, I think that the Twitter versus CHES, EES salience, the difference in the results, that is that the salience that party attached to the EU in Twitter communication as compared to the CHES deserves perhaps a little bit more discussion. And this is because I somewhat agree that Twitter is not, I mean, a communication, social media that is well diffused across the population, but it's also true that a lot of times these measures are used as proxies, actually, of the salience that parties attach. So not really just a measure of how parties communicate on that social media, but actually how parties attach salience to a given issue, especially in the short term and by the campaign. And during the electoral campaigns. So the point is, why is this difference? Is the difference rather related to the fact that Twitter is able to catch this short-term effect, while the CHES is somewhat a more overall assessment of the position of the parties? And therefore, if this is true, this tells us something about perhaps how EU distance is related to the vote choice. That is, perhaps, this is my interpretation, of course, that EU distance is becoming a more solid predictor, and therefore is more related to the long-term, let's say, position or stable positions of parties about the EU rather than the fluctuations derived from electoral campaigns, during the electoral campaigns about the relevance of some issue rather than others. And this will be a substantive result. So that means that, again, EU is not anymore an issue that is important or not important according to the relevance that has during a specific electoral campaign, but rather is something that is becoming more and more stable as predictor of individual choices. Now, another suggestion is to better clarify perhaps when there is the clear distinction in a dummy variable between Eurosceptic and Europhile parties, how these are classified. And in this case, I assume that this has been based using the CHES measure, continuous measure, and so what is the cut point and how this cut point perhaps were chosen. Now, as we all know, this is not something on which we have any magic bullet because it's always an arbitrary choice, but to some extent it would be nice to also to know which are the points of the scale in which this has been done. Then I have other comments that are more related to the methods or the modeling. And another point that a little bit puzzled me, I may say, but I think that, but to some extent perhaps needs a little bit more attention is the fact that the second research question of the paper is to some extent relates to the relative importance of the EU issues compared to other issues. And as presented by Nicolò, they indeed test this by including in a single model left-right distance, EU distance, immigration distance, and redistribution distance between party and voters, and so gauging the difference in the impact of these variables, in the correlation between these variables and the dependent variable. What I'm puzzled with is a little bit whether or not these models should actually include the left-right distance and at the same time immigration and redistribution. Luca and Nicolò shared with me earlier the paper that they presented at the end, so I know that in that paper they present a correlation matrix and they show that these issues and these distances actually correlate not much. But I may say that perhaps a more robust test will be not including the left-right, for instance, in these models, because to some extent immigration and redistribution are considered normal at least, or assumed to be at least dimensions, two dimensions that compose the left-right dimension, or left-right super issue sometimes called. So perhaps including left-right and these others distances creates to some extent left-right might control, might deflate the effect of the others, and therefore the EU issue effect might appear stronger than what actually it is. So this is just, of course, another robustness check that I suggest to take in order to really go to give a better answer to that research question. That is the relative importance of the EU issue as compared to other issues in the voting calculus. And there are then other aspects that I think deserve a little bit attention. It's not clear to me, for instance, whether in cross-level interactions in the random, the mixed effects models, there are random slopes for those variables at a lower level that are interested by the cross-level interaction. And this is, although, let's say, a modeling issue is related to the effects that you see later on, because it's pretty known that if you do not free the slopes of these lower level variables, then these creates interactions that have anti-conservative standard errors, and therefore the statistical significance might be an effect of this rather than others. But of course, these are issues that I understand that with ECCP data is difficult because you have just 5 countries, but it could be possible with the EES data. So and another issue about the modeling is about the centering of the variables. The cross-level interactions, I think it would be interesting to see what happens when we center the variables in each context, because this will give a clear interpretation of that interaction that relates to what Luca and Nicolò are indeed investigating, that is whether or not the salience affects the relationship, because without these centering, we don't know whether the effect is given by national averages, group averages, or by the relationship between the variables. There are then other comments, of course, more or less important, but I think that more or less these are the robustness check of things on which I will consider, at least in the when moving to the EES analysis. And a matter of centering also regards the salience at the party level, because if the salience is measured at the party level, that is a sort of medium level between the individuals and the context, then also in that case centering might be interesting, because we don't know whether the salience is a matter of an entire political system salience about the EU, the effect on the vote, on the vote calculus, or rather is whether or not exist inside the political system parties that attach much more salience as the average of their of the given political system. Then I will close by saying that I agree, and I'm pretty happy that the Luca and Nicolò want to engage with a causal analysis, because I think that correlation is clear in this case. Now, I think that the question would be who is following whom? Is the parties that are seeking the voters, the voters that are taking cues for the parties? I agree. I'm more on the side of Luca and Nicolò, that is, voters take cues from the parties, but of course, with observational data and cross-sectional data, we cannot really claim it. And then I would really appreciate an analysis that takes into consideration the differences between first and second order elections, because the analysis presented by Luca are mostly about Nicolò, are mostly about the Europeanization, let's say, of the national arena. While analyzing the differences between the European elections and the first order election, national elections might allow to investigate on the one side, again, the Europeanization of national elections, but also on the other side, the whether or not the long debate, the long-lasting question of whether or not second order elections are still actually second order or are becoming something else. And this is the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. So Luca, Nicolò, I don't know which one of you wants to come back to some of the comments.
Okay, so I will start and then I'll leave the floor to Luca if there's anything to integrate. The discussion on Twitter results, I agree that is quite intriguing. It's something that we need to not only let's say document, but we also need to interpret. We're trying to do that in the paper, but a bit shortly, because we also have, let's say, space constraints, and it would be interesting though to invest more on this aspect, because I also wonder, given these results and the mismatch between evidence which is produced by the Chapel Hill salience measurement and the Twitter salience measurement, I wonder whether it is correct to consider the two as interchangeable. As Giuseppe said, many times Twitter salience is considered just a proxy, or, let's say, the only measurement of party salience. And maybe this is not correct. And I think Giuseppe is also right when he says that probably Chapel Hill, because it is more reflective of the overall communication strategies of parties and the leaders, but also it has a retrospective, and it is not only confined to the electoral moment and the electoral cycle, but when experts assign scores to parties, they consider also their past, their recent past, and not only the 30 days before the elections. So maybe the Chapel Hill measurement is more correct, is more reflective of reality, whereas Twitter is more sensitive to fluctuations of the last weeks before the election, so the particular moment at stake. And also, I would say, I was very intrigued by introducing Twitter, but I'm not a big fan, because we know that communication there only consists of few characters. It's not the same thing. So maybe even in a methodological paper, we could engage into this discussion. It's a little bit difficult to do that when you have such density of results and really, to give full credit to these results. Then about dropping left-right, we tried many tests. Really, I have to say that we have the simple model without the other distance variables. Then we added one by one. In the end, I have to say that it was probably no way to get the paper accepted without the left-right distance control. So sometimes you also do what they ask you to do. But of course, we can play with that. And I have to say that we already did it. And I mean, results hold, they are confirmed. Then I fully agree that there are huge differences in interpretations depending whether we are working with a small n or the large n. The multi-level effect can be let's say, differently taken into consideration. With 5 cases, we can only use country dummies. And also here and there, we can also analyze individual countries and what happens. Whereas in a large N analysis, we need to have a completely different modeling, and which is also interesting and, also allows to say other things. So the picture, I agree, will be complete only when we have the small n and the large n. The challenge here is, again, how to make the two research undertakings compatible, speaking to each other, because the data are so different. I mean, we have, on the one hand, the second order elections, on the other hand, the first order elections. We really wanted to engage into a small, let's say, a large N analysis using first order elections. But there are problems. We found there are problems with data. So we'll see. Maybe there is also a way in between, like we can consider as, let's say, a more sizable number of countries for first order elections, maybe not 27, but maybe something between 12, 15. That would also be acceptable. And then we can compare at a different stage, we can compare to the second order election effects with the largest N. So that's another possibility. And then thank you for emphasizing the efforts of moving into causal analysis, because that is really, as you can imagine, that is really challenging. I mean, try to isolate the effects of EU party shifts, positional shifts on voters who change their voting preferences. That is, of course, very challenging. So we'll try to do that. It will probably take a little bit of time. Thank you. And thank you for having such a careful read of our paper.
My pleasure.
Luca, maybe? I don't know if Luca wants to add something.
Yes. Thank you very much, Giuseppe. That's a very careful analysis that you provided us on our paper. And I concur on many of your comments, especially when you refer to the importance of the EU issues as a solid measure, which is not simply affected by one electoral campaign, is not so simply context-based. It seems that the European Union issues are somehow entering into decision-making process of voters. Yes, as Nicolò also said, I mean, about the ranking predictors, yes, there are, I mean, difficulties, and I do agree with you that it is probable that if we try to correlate party positions on the left-right dimension and immigration and redistribution, they might be more strongly correlated. Although as the party position are not strictly our independent variable, I do believe the test that we made remains solid. Yes, the cut-off point that we chose following and according to the literature, as you pointed out, choosing a cut-off point is always an arbitrary operation. The cut-off point that we chose is 3.5. That to us separate, distinguish 3.5, that for us separate and distinguish what is Eurosceptic and what is not, Eurosceptic and what is not. Again, thank you very much, Giuseppe.
Thank you very much. So now we have time for questions and comments from the audience. So just, raise your hands and present yourself and ask your questions or make any comments you would like to make. In the meantime, I will maybe start. As I had, I listened with great interest to your paper, Nicolò and Luca. I had similar comments as Giuseppe also on the Twitter data that you could explain a little bit more and investigate, and a methodological paper might be an option there to investigate that. I was wondering also about whether you can measure, and I don't have the methodological background to tell you how to do it, but the salience in the country or the salience by the party, and to see whether, because in your whole presentation, I was lacking information by country and by parties. For instance, can you imagine that there is a difference between mainstream parties among the Europhile and the non-mainstream, like the Greens and the Liberals, who are usually more advocating on EU issues than the socialists and the members of the EPP, whether there is a dynamic of government opposition at stake when on the distance, or how you talk about EU or the salience of the EU, because if you're in government, you have a different constraint than if you're in the opposition. And I would also be very interested in your future analysis on the difference between first and second order election, on split ticket voting, especially, and on whether a switch in one direction would make any difference on that aspect. So basically, that were my comments or questions. You take it as you want. I see Jonathan as I don't know whether a question or a comment.
Yeah, I can come in too. So I have a very specific question. I enjoyed the paper. It's very thought-provoking. Something that struck me quite a lot was your emphasis on Brexit as possibly explaining the change over time that you see. And of course, you don't have any real direct evidence for that claim. That would, in a way, be a separate or complementary line of inquiry. And I guess I would ask, and one can look at this from several points of view. One is while many people are arguing, indeed, that Brexit has had a significant impact on both party discourses or strategies and on voter attitudes. I wonder, whether you can link this to other studies that try to address it using, shall we say, similar kinds of methodologies. And secondly, from a causal point of view, there would be the concern to disentangle whether we're seeing what's going on is that the parties are changing their positions or the voters are changing their reactions to the party positions. So I realize that it's really another paper, but at the same time, you referred to it repeatedly as hypothetical explanatory factor in your observations. So maybe you can say something about how you would approach this.
Nicolò and Luca, I let you reply to that before reading the question that Caroline asked in the chat. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna do that. So, have you considered the effect of party unity? The conventional argument in the literature is that those parties which are internally more divided are less likely to assign salience to EU issues. Particular centre-right parties tend to be divided, German CDU, British Conservatives, as they support economic integration but reject further political integration and the social cultural effects of transnationalism. Would it be feasible to include a party unity variable? Some studies have used it. For example, Twitter communication by MPs to measure unity. Okay, interesting question. Natalie, should we answer? Should we answer your comments?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
So thanks again. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Caroline. Okay, I think we already addressed the issue of the methodological paper, and yeah, I absolutely take this as motivation, incentives to go for that paper that maybe we have, let's say, postponed for later, but I see there is quite a bit of interest. Then introducing party families or party types, various types, mainstream versus challengers and so on, everything can be done basically. All of this can be done because, I mean, there are ways to measure how mainstream, how challenging, how radical and so on a party can be. So very easy to introduce that. And the same thing we can do with the different party families. Of course, there is a greater interest to do that in the large N analysis, because the smaller the set of countries, the more, country specificities you have, and also the different categories would present lower cases. So we need to go for that in the large N analysis, and absolutely it will be done. At a certain point with the large N analysis, we will need to have probably 2 or 3 papers in the pipeline, one considering the first order versus second order difference, another one consider party types and party differences and so on. So this will be done. Then Jonathan, the impact of Brexit. This is also super interesting. And we do not have direct information, direct evidence of that. So it's only indirect, it's in our interpretations. I think this is quite acceptable because, if we consider context and we consider those shifts in pro-EU mobilization, so again, pro-Europeans striking back, defending probably the EU project, the only interpretation we have is that Brexit really constitutes a real threat to the process. And probably it has been perceived as such by many pro-Europeans. So it was a shock that reverted the tendency. The tendency before was one of having anti-EU mobilization, but when something so serious as Brexit happens, then you also have pro-EU mobilization, which is interesting. And this is something that also speaks to, let's say, theoretical efforts, more, let's say, fine-grained interpretations on the impact of crises, which, of course, are very threatening for the EU project, but at the same time, they can also create windows of opportunity. And so it would be interesting to also read our results in that perspective, in the perspective of a window of opportunity which is open in defense of the EU project and in defense of the EU at large. And when we will engage into the causal analysis, tracing shifts in party positions and in voter preferences, and try to combine the two, to relate the two, and see who cues whom, maybe this can emerge more clearly. So,
I mean, you could, in principle, use public opinion data on support for national exit from the EU in your country analyses. I mean, actually there was just an article in the Dutch newspaper, the NRC, which was about changing levels of support for EU exit, and showed how these varied across countries, and they had 3 data points, basically, I mean, showing different patterns, but in general, a rejection of EU exit across many countries.
yeah. So we can also try to introduce that would come from a different data set, from the Eurobarometer. But I mean, we can try to combine, we can try to insert in the research design also support for on-country exits. This could also be maybe an independent variable. This could be an independent variable in our research design, and see how this changes over time. And finally, the question by Caroline. Yes, I think we are perfectly able to introduce that other control, or maybe if it is more interesting to frame a hypothesis, it could also become more central to our analysis, which is maybe for a 4th paper. But okay, one day. But yeah, we can also try to model intra-party unity and see if this also has an influence, whether parties assign different levels of salience to the EU depending on how much united, how much divided they are on the issues. So this can easily be done because there is a item in the Chapel Hill data set which allows to do that.
I perhaps may jump for a second to reply to some of your comments. Yes, it is very indeed, I mean, I wanted to say to you, Natalie, that's commented on the an interesting research stream concerning party families, and also the governing status of parties. I do believe there are interesting preliminary findings, and that, for instance, in a research that I'm making, I found evidence how much for Eurosceptic parties switching from the opposition to the government tend to moderate the degree of European Union issue voting. So I do believe that's a very interesting and promising research stream, and also party families, especially studying, as you said, the more vocal pro-Europeans agents and actors, such as the Green Party family, but also to some extent many liberal parties that are in the yes, I tend to agree that the research agenda suggested by Jonathan is so much promising, and would also help us to better disentangle, as Nicolò said, who is queuing whom. As far as the analysis, preliminary analysis on the Brexit effect, we have these many preliminary analyses, many works suggesting us that it was a moment of attention for the more Europhile attitudes across the continents, that the focus on this moment of disintegration made many citizens realize, outside from the UK, the utilitarian benefits of the European Union membership. That's what the literature at the moment suggests. It would be so much interesting to include a variable, as you suggested, that can capture that into a model. And as for party unity, that would be interesting to test, because one of the theories, one of the assumptions that was very strong, especially on Europhile parties, that Europhile parties were internally divided over the issues of European integration. So try to test again this kind of hypothesis would open an interesting research agenda again. Thank you for your questions.
Are there any other comments or questions from the audience?
And just to say that I posted a link to the Dutch article, which has a nice chart that you should be able to read easily without reading
Speaking Dutch.
And it also, I mean, it shows fluctuation across the more recent period, which is interesting as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. It interests me as well, so I'm going to read it later in Dutch. I don't see other questions or comments, so I would like to thank Nicolò and Luca for their interesting paper and a lot of success with all the papers you will be writing on the topics and with this very interesting research, and to invite everybody from the audience for the next seminar, which will take place on the 16th of February at the same time, so 4 p.m. Central European time. Have a good rest of the afternoon, everyone, and hopefully see you next month at the seminar.